Have you ever read the documentation for an API and said to yourself, wow, this is a concise and well written page. I really want to meet the author? Well, I did, and so I looked at the contributors of this article and wrote to Stephen White, a senior content developer at Microsoft, asking for a chance to chat with him. And this is how it went.
Could you just like start off with just elaborating on sort of how you started your technical career? So you mentioned that you were a software developer, right before you even started working at Microsoft. So what was that like?
So straight out of college, I got a job writing COBOL, which is a business language. It's a very old-fashioned business language, running on IBM mainframes. So I worked for a UK supermarket at the head office, the IT centre of that. Now, I didn't learn COBOL at college, so they sent us on a 5-week intensive course to learn, full-time 5-week course to learn COBOL. And then I spent probably about 4 years writing COBOL. And it's very, very different from Windows development, or at least it's very different from GUI, from graphical Windows development. Of course, there's really very little in the way of UI, or at least it's very basic UI with COBOL. But Windows really interested me, and I remember learning from Charles Petzold's. Charles Petzold, of course, famous Windows content author. So I learned from his stuff, and I also I taught myself C and C++, because I was much more interested in those as languages than in COBOL. They just seemed much more expressive and interesting. I mean, the whole concept of object orientation, polymorphism, all that kind of stuff was just really, really interesting. And then, of course, being able to draw on the screen. Of course, that was back in original Win32. Own a draw. You basically draw everything in response to the draw message. Again, very, very different from what we've got today with well, I mean, really there was I was gonna jump to WPF, but and and the Windows runtime stuff that developed from that. But of course, there were other stepping stones in between, interesting stepping stones through things like Windows Forms on .NET. So is there anything, before I move on to joining Microsoft, is there anything specifically you're interested in what I covered there?
No, but I think it was interesting that you just mentioned Charles Pretzel. I'm pretty sure I had read one of his books as like a textbook in one of my freshman courses.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it was about computer architecture or the language of C. I think it was the language of C.
Right. So not C# then, C but not C#.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because I only ask because I think he's done C# books as well as C. Yeah, and in fact, of course he was using C in that book of his that I read, I think. But of course, of course, it's possible to use C++ as well as C, obviously to call Win32 APIs. So yeah, Charles Petzold, very good resources there. Now, and I guess it's probably worth me saying that I'm sure that was one of the early kind of seeds that was planted in my head, reading the way Charles Petzold presented this information, very very intelligently, and just really, really clever. The content, the way he presented it, the teaching, very copious use of course code examples. So yeah, I was really impressed with that, and I think that must have sowed some seeds in me to want to emulate that kind of quality of content, and also the quality of software as well, because of course I was a software engineer first, not a writer. So and it was things like the Visual C++ compiler. Really impressed with the technical excellence of that, and and products, obviously products such as Office, and there was a a product called Encarta, which was an encyclopedia, a multimedia encyclopedia that ran off CDs, I think, or even DVDs. I can't remember. But the quality of that was especially the graphics in there was really interesting. And so I guess that was me really. That was the period during which I really got interested in Microsoft's products, Microsoft's philosophy and approach to software, just excellence really, both the product and the documentation of it. I mean, even like MSDN, even looking at the excuse me, even looking at an API, a topic that was documenting API, and they just broke it all down very, very rationally, very, very beautifully. The syntax, the parameters, and all that stuff. I was really impressed with that, and I think that must have just made an impression and sunk into my mind for later. It was going to bloom later. So shall I move on to Microsoft?
Yeah, sure.
So this was at a period of time when I felt like I was getting good enough at software development to move into contract roles rather than full-time roles. I was interested in moving into contract roles. So I actually went through the process of setting up a limited company in the UK, which I never used. That's the thing. I never used it. I jumped through all the hoops, created a company, and I got registered with an agent. And the agent said, well, I can get you some contracts, but there's an opening at Microsoft in the UK. So I said, oh yeah, I'm definitely interested in going for that, but I didn't expect to get the job. But it was a very long process. It was seven interviews spread out over 7 weeks. So it was a long time. I'm just going to put that screen back on because it's gone a bit dark over here. So yeah, so it was tough, and I was expecting to fail at like every one of those 7 interviews. I was expecting to fail at some point. I was waiting for that, and I didn't. Thankfully, managed to get through it. But it's probably worth talking about the interview process a little bit there, because there was a whole range of different kinds of interviews. So, for example, the very first interview was a free form. It was basically put a 30-minute presentation together and just come in and give this presentation. It could be about anything. I also should say what the job was, what the role was that I was applying for, because of course that's important when we're talking about interviewing. The role was a developer consultant. So essentially you were using your knowledge of software development to help Microsoft customers do the same thing. So naturally there's an element of, obviously communication, going and talking to them and presenting, giving actual presentations. So it did make sense that they wanted to see how we fared, when giving presentations. So I went in there with a PowerPoint deck that I'd put together, and it was about visualizing information, showing something in an analog way, showing something in a digital way, showing using the third dimension, using 3D or whatever it was, because I was also interested in 3D graphics as well at the time. It was OpenGL at the time. It wasn't until a lot later that I learned Direct 3D. So that was one interview. Another one was very much deep in the C++ language. And they'd ask things like, is an exception created when the system raises an exception? Is that put on the stack, or is a new object created on the heap? Things like that, and also a lot about COM+, which was COM.
Yeah, I've heard of COM pointers.
COM+ as well. Yeah, so COM+ was originally MTS, Microsoft Transaction Server, and then they just changed the name to COM+. So there was a lot of questions about the way that works, the way things like contexts and threadings and apartments and all that stuff. They wanted to know about that, and they also wanted to know about, relational databases. Did you understand you know, the ACID, the ACID principles and all that kind of thing. So and of course there was a bit of writing on the whiteboard, which is of course very standard for a technical screening, to stand up and mess about on the whiteboard for a bit. So that was probably the most intense one, because it was so technical. But it was exactly the kind of thing I'm interested in. So it was also enjoyable as well as being kind of stressful. And then another one of the interviews was role playing. You actually had to, you were told that you were a consultant, you know, representing Microsoft, and you had to go to this bank, and I can't remember what the name of the bank was, but it was a fictional name of a bank, and you had to go in there and represent Microsoft, and they would play. So the interviewer would play the part of the customer, and obviously I would play the part of the consultant, and the kind of thing they were looking for. They wanted to reach the point where you didn't know the answer. And as soon as they wanted to know what you would do when you reached the point where you didn't know the answer. Now, fortunately, I'd already been clued in on this in advance. I already knew that you know what they wanted you to do was to say, was to make a note of the question or whatever the information was that they were seeking. Make a note of it and say, yeah, I don't have the answer to that right now, but I'm making a note, and I'll go and do some research, or I'll go and ask one of my colleagues, or even I'll go and talk to Microsoft Corporation, because of course this was a job for Microsoft Limited in the UK, which is of course a subsidiary of Microsoft Corporation. So yeah, so it was a long interview process, but I thankfully got through it, and then I spent about another 4 years there as a developer consultant. And it was stressful, because you had to be able to field questions that were really to do with anything, any product or service or whatever related to Microsoft that had any kind of API surface. So, you know, that could be a lot. There was a lot of different, obviously. I mean, and it, you know, the API surface is growing all the time. I mean, this was this was way before Azure even, you know. But certainly there was plenty of API surface to cover, and it was far more than anybody could, even then, than anybody could really know in a lifetime. So yeah, I spent a lot of time on customer site. Spent quite a bit of time giving code reviews. So, you know, looking through their code and giving comments and hints and tips about, you know, improving security, readability, efficiency, you know, performance, that kind of thing. So that was a good period. Now during that period, I also wrote my first MSDN articles. Of course, MSDN is now docs.microsoft.com, but of course it was MSDN back then. And I was working with a bank in London. They were doing registration-free com, and so I was doing quite a bit of research into how to make, you know, registration-free com work in the way that they wanted to. And there were gaps in the documentation, so I ended up writing 2 rather lengthy articles, including code. Well, actually, it wasn't so much code as the contents of manifest files, but it was still, you know, technical. So I wrote those 2, and then I got in touch with a writer in MSDN in the US over email, and we worked on. He helped me understand the process and the workflow and the life cycle for getting a topic published. And I think he probably edited my articles, and then eventually they did go live. So that was good. So knowledge transfer in terms of just doing a little bit of teaching with the customers, that was part of the job. Giving presentations, code reviews, knowledge transfer was very much a big part of it. And I felt like writing these MSDN articles was was very similar, kind of knowledge transfer thing. It just felt good. It felt like a vocation because you're not just writing a topic from 9 to 5 and then you stop. It's in your head, right? You're completely consumed by this challenging, by this challenging technology, and of course you don't want to stop working on it. It just becomes all consuming if it's the right content, and if you just happen to be sufficiently interested in it, then it is well, that's the way it is. So that really I really enjoyed that process, and I wanted to come to the US. I wanted to come to Redmond. So that was another thing that I did. It was my manager at the time that encouraged that. So I went through that process, and when I came to the US, it was to join a product team. The product team were creating expression blend. It's called Blend now. It's that XAML design surface. But so you know about that, right? You know about Blend.
Yeah, I've had the chance to use it a few times.
Cool. So and of course towards the end of my 9 years, I was in that product team for 9 years. Towards the end, which was around about version 5, we were a lot of the code from Blend was also finding its way into Visual Studio itself. So there was that nice kind of synergy between the two products. But I started out in the Blend team. I spent the first year writing technical content. So I was a programmer writer when I first joined Microsoft Corp, and then my manager or my manager's manager was it anyway. The person who was in charge of the program managers encouraged me to apply for a program manager role. So and that was that was pretty technical as well. Interview process. Because it's a XAML design surface, and there's XAML of course can't exist on its own. It's part of an actual application. So there's a lot of knowledge that you need around the rest of the code in the app. It's not just the XAML; it's all the rest of it as well. So knowing about that was important for that team. So I did that, and I was So I was a PM for about eight or 9 years there in that team, and really the only code I was writing at the time was sample code or tutorial code. So there was still this kind of link. I was still very much in the kind of knowledge transfer role even there. I was writing a lot of sample code, but I was also writing a lot of specs, obviously, which is again communication. This time it's human language and communicating ideas to the devs and the testers. So that was great as well, and that really played to my abilities to use language kind of thing, and of course interests. So that was a good mix, like I say, it was language and it was code, and it was ideas. It was generating ideas for new features based on what the customers were asking for and what they were using the product for. So that was really interesting. But again, I mean, so I'll be honest, and I'll say that was a challenging role as well. I stayed in it for a long time. I stayed in that role beyond my comfort level. Because I was more interested in I was more interested in the kind of work, kind of solo, work that you just do on your own, whether that's writing or writing code. But there was a lot of still obviously in a PM role, there's a lot of customer contact, which I did enjoy, but I also found it stressful because I'm kind of an introvert. So it's not entirely good, it's not entirely bad. It's a mix of things that you find both interesting and a little bit challenging and tiring. But I really wanted something that was where I could really just focus on becoming expert in something, in an API surface, really, I think is really what I was kind of gravitating back towards. And of course, the Windows APIs were of course always been an interest throughout most of my career. So I did get an opportunity then to apply for a role which you know this as a content developer, the term content developer. You'll also hear it described as a programmer writer, although I think that's a kind of old-fashioned term now, but it's the term I prefer because it really does describe UI, literally half programmer, half writer. So I think that's a really good one. And technically, you hear technical writer, which mean, I think they pretty much all mean the same thing. They're all pretty much synonymous. So the job I got when I went into programmer writer, this last time, it was in the Windows Phone SDK team, or it was in it was writing for the Windows Phone SDK, which of course isn't a thing anymore. But it was pretty new at the time, and it was great writing Windows apps for this nice, fun, cute little kind of form factor instead of big screen. And in fact, that they used to jokingly call Windows Phone small Windows and Windows big Windows. So because of just the size of the screen. So I worked on little Windows for a couple of years, and then we merged out. The phone team merged with the big Windows team, so we were all one big team. And the reason for that was because the operating systems themselves, the actual source code used in the operating systems for phone and PC, began to use a lot of the same kind of, essentially the same source code. So they were certainly the same technology and the same architecture. They were really becoming one. And that, and then of course when the Windows runtime came along, of course that was in fact it was the Windows runtime back then. But then when UWP, when Universal Windows Platform came along, that then at that point they really were the same thing. So yeah, so going from Windows Phone to big Windows was a very smooth transition for me. It was it's the same, it's made of the same stuff, it's just at a different scale. Another thing I'm interested in, actually, another thing that something that attracted me to Blend at the time was the user interface. In fact you remember when I was talking about the transition from COBOL to Windows, it was the GUI, it was the graphics that appealed to me, and then of course the graphics in OpenGL and later DirectX, Direct3D, that interested me, and the graphics in Blend was really interesting. The things they could do with vector graphics and gradients and all that kind of thing. Shiny buttons, like gel buttons, were very much very popular at the time. So yeah, so I've always been interested in that, and so when it came to the kind of marriage, if you like, between Windows Phone and the desktop version of Windows, this notion of being able to build an application, a single application that can scale and lay out and be very much dynamic in terms of user interface, that was also really interesting as well. And so so being a programmer writer was it did mean I was actually writing more code. So of course I wasn't writing specs anymore, but I was writing language. I was explaining things and writing source code and making sure that the source code was, it had to be code reviewed at the time. In the team I was in, the code was code reviewed, so it had to be good. It had to be decent quality, but it also, as I said a while ago, it has to be educational. That's the most important thing, is that it's educational, and it's not obscure. It's not difficult to understand. It's got to be showing you something about the APIs that you're calling, and whether that's using an individual API, like for example, how do I create a structure? How do I initialize a structure or whatever it is in a particular way before passing it to a function in order to get the desired output, and how do I respond to the return, what's the return code, what do the return codes mean. So, but not only at the individual API level, but also showing how different APIs interact with each other when you're calling different APIs from the same feature area, or you're combining APIs from different feature areas to achieve a kind of more rounded real world scenario or task kind of thing. So I found all of that really interesting as well. And there's also a lot of maintenance in this job. It's not just writing new content all the time or new code all the time. There's a lot of just things like fixing broken links and just fixing layout format issues. We have an issue with tables. Sometimes if tables are too wide, if you've got either a table or a code listing that's longer than a screen height, then you've got to be very careful not to make that too wide for the screen, because as soon as that horizontal scroll bar appears and the horizontal scroll bar is off the bottom of the screen, you've got to scroll down to get to the horizontal scroll bar, scroll across, scroll back, and it really makes the experience dreadful. Now, if you've got a touch screen, it's not so bad, because you can just scroll, you can just pan around in 2 dimensions using the touch screen. Or if it's a piece of code, if it's a code listing, there's a copy button. You can click the copy button and wait for the green check mark, and then you can copy that somewhere else, whether it's Notepad or whatever, so that you can actually see what's going on and you get a better experience. But yeah, unfortunately we do have that issue sometimes with tables being too wide, and there's not really usually any single solution for those, or there's no like one size fits all fix. You've often got to go in and break, manually break the lines of code in a particular place to make the width, to maximize the width, but not make it too, obviously it only has to be a character too long, and suddenly you've got scroll bars. So, and then when it comes to tables, you've just got to think, right, how do I refactor this table, or what is it that I can do to kind of make this table fit into the width of the screen? So have you got any questions or directions you'd like to go in?
Yeah. So I think it was interesting that you mentioned like code width. So is there something that you try to sort of enforce more naturally, write code that's more compact?
When we're actually writing in Visual Studio, you mean?
Yeah.
No, to be honest, nothing really. I mean, I don't have, and I probably should. I mean, I probably should have like an actual number of characters wide that I don't go beyond. That you make a good point. I guess it would be possible for me to do that in Visual Studio and make it, actually do the wrapping myself. The thing is, the only thing I do is I try to, it's not an exact. I guess it's not an exact thing. I'm aware of it, of course, when I'm writing the code. I'm aware of not making them too wide, but it's not something that I particularly measure. And really, it does depend. Of course, it depends on what the actual width of the reader's screen is, and of course it does vary. I usually try and fit it to my screen width. I try and choose something that I think is going to be, the most reasonably common kind of resolution. But of course that changes over time, so you got to keep, of course it's growing over time.
Yeah.
So I can do that certainly with my own code. I could do it in Visual Studio as you suggest, which is a really good idea. But even if I'm doing it, in the I use Visual Studio Code to actually write the topics, and that's where, of course, the final formatting of the code is. So I just do it in there. I just try and make sure it fits, and then I have to keep going to the preview, to the review site, and make sure that it fits into, onto my screen. But of course, as I say, I'm aware that somebody somewhere is going to have a narrower screen even than mine. But hopefully, those are in the minority. And it doesn't come up that much in user feedback. This is something we've not talked about yet, which is GitHub issues, which is the primary way in which we get customer feedback about the docs. There was, like I say, it doesn't come up very often there, but there wasn't one notable case where there was a table. It was actually a direct 3D table, and the table was, the table, I'm trying to think how wide it would be in actual physical screens, but I would think it would be between 4 and 6 physical monitors width. That's how wide the table was. So you can imagine trying to horizontally scroll, and it was taller than a monitor, so taller than a screen width. So unless you had a touch screen, you really had a lot of trouble there. So to solve that one, I actually wrote some code to refactor the markdown that constituted the table. But coincidentally, late last week, I did get an email from a dev saying that I fixed the issue with the scrolling, but it actually makes the content for the use case that this particular dev had. It was an internal dev, not a customer. But for the use case that this particular dev had, they were saying that it wasn't as good as it was before. So that's an interesting kind of trade-off. There really was no way we could make that table readable in the format it was in. So that I consider that still a work in progress. I'm going to have to rethink the solution to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I actually have a freshman professor in college who sort of forced us to keep our code within 80 characters per line.
Okay.
And he would enforce it and he was pretty strict about it. So even if you were one character extra, like if you wrote 81 characters, you would lose like 50% of the grade for the assignment.
Yeah.
And I guess since he's been doing that for all of the freshman CS classes that he teaches, it's sort of like carried forward to me, even now that I'm like a junior in college. And
Right.
I obviously can't keep all of my code to 80 characters per line, but every time I do see like a big line of code, I always remember what he used to say about that. So I guess it's interesting how these little lessons have such a big impact. So do you feel like the style that you would write code for a code sample or for an article, like that would have a huge impact on the customers who are basically other programmers trying to learn some API, some Microsoft API or a particular tool? So do you sort of have your own rules or do you have any I guess any opinions on code styles like the KNR method, how your braces should be aligned, how many spaces, how many tabs, things like that?
Yeah, and of course the one big one is of course the tabs versus spaces thing.
Yeah.
So in my own code, in my private, my personal hobbies and projects and things, I use tabs, but I use spaces for content. I use spaces for my work code, and the reason is because it actually lays out, it formats much nicer using spaces. Is the KNR one to put the curly brace at the end of the function, or is it to put it on the next line down?
I think that's like a modified version of KNR where you put it on the next line.
Okay, because I always put it on the next line down, and most of what I see actually is most of what I see other people doing is that. So I do personally find it's more readable. So you're asking a good question. It's really about coding styles and formatting styles. What is the purpose? And the purpose, I think, is to make it more readable. I can certainly, if I bring that open curly brace down to the next line, then it really does line up, vertically with the closing brace. And if I've got, of course, if I've got lots of nested ones, I can see where they begin and end. And it's, to me, that's really valuable. I think that's really valuable, just to be able to glance at the thing and see where it is. And another thing I do, I'll throw this idea out there as well, is that if there's a chunk of code, if I'm showing a function from a sample, let's say it's a sample that you can go to GitHub, you can download the sample, open it in VS, and you can see everything there. If I want to call out if I want to draw the reader's attention to a particular function, but there's only a little bit of that I'm interested in them looking at, then I'll remove the bit that's not of interest in my copy of it, and I'll put 3 dots. But I'll align the 3 dots where the curly brace was for that particular code block, if that makes sense for that particular thing. So and I find the result is that it's a shorter listing, of course, and you can see exactly where the bit was that was taken out. And I very often just put a comment saying what is happening here. Just a couple of words, just to show that that I've snicked the bit out that does whatever, update the database or whatever. I'm trying to think of other things. It so happens that sometimes, because of the screen width thing, I do end up stacking parameters vertically. So foo, first parameter, then parameter, especially if they're really long. If they're really long types or something like that, I'll put them in there. I'm trying to think of other things. So I talked about earlier. Talked about using namespaces where it might be confusing to omit them. This is an interesting one, because it really is a trade-off between space and comprehensibility. Obviously, if I never mention namespaces, then my code's a lot shorter, especially width-wise. But I do tend to. I'll tell you what I do. Let's say I'm writing about files and folders, then I'll put Windows storage in front of the types that I am teaching you about. But if I happen to use if I'm using like something in XAML, let's say, for argument's sake, to display a text block to display a file name, something like that, then I don't bother, because we're not focusing on that here, right? The code's just there to help you. So I'll just put text block, and I'll probably put using Windows UI XAML controls at the top. If I feel that's necessary. A lot of the time, like I say, if that's not the main focus of the snippet, then it doesn't. I feel like it doesn't. It's not as important for the customer to know exactly what the namespace is that thing's in. But I do feel it's important for them to see that the namespace of the actual APIs that we're trying to focus on is there. Names of, probably worth talking about, names of variables and parameters and things for sample code. I tend to, so I don't abbreviate. I don't shrink something down so that you've got no idea what it could possibly mean. I try and err on the side of some kind of lengthy, not there's a sweet spot. Obviously, you've got to get something that's reasonably. I like to I like it to contain something of the type and also something of what you're using it for. So I might, for the example of a text block that's displaying a file's name, I might call it file name text block, which is not too long. Sometimes I do file name TB or that kind of thing. And then, of course, there's things like if I'm writing a C++, I know that the product team, they prefer data members to be M underscore, which is something that's something that I went away from for a long time. I went away from that, and I would omit the M underscore, and I would put this, this arrow. But they didn't like that. They don't like that in that team. They don't like the this. They say get rid of the this, and just put M underscore, and then that makes it clear that that it belongs to, yeah. So that's one thing. Can you think of any other potential choices that you would have to make in code?
I think one thing you mentioned about variable names, how verbose do you want it to be?
Yeah.
Especially when you're like looking at a code sample for the first time and you just are finding it hard to navigate. There's also like how do you capitalize things within functions and
Yes. Yes.
classes, which
Yeah.
so I actually have like something a little aside, but um, if you were to, let's say, just switch up your convention or your style for when you're writing an article, do you expect to like receive a bunch of like GitHub issues or a bunch of like emails from devs saying like, oh, why is it this way? This is not the convention, or things, something like that.
I would say it's relatively rare for that to happen. I wouldn't necessarily expect that. Now it's a different story when if you're actually submitting a sample application to GitHub to so I work with devs who own various sample repos. So if I'm doing something like recently, for example, I took a C++ CX sample and I ported it to C++ WinRT, and I submitted the resulting project for code review. And during that process, to be honest, during that process, it was really a case of the owner, the person who owned the repo, would just go through and make any necessary changes there and then. They would just fix it in place. So in fact, that would be easy for me, because I would simply, it wouldn't be a case of it bouncing back to me and saying, oh, you need to put M underscore here. It would be that I could see that they'd made that change, and I would know, oh yeah, I better do that next time, just to save them the bother. But actually, no, I mean, I really haven't seen any feedback from public GitHub issues around this kind of issue, to be honest. And I don't know if it's just that we tend to get it right, or if it's that they tend to be more forgiving when it comes to sample code. I don't know, but it could be either. It could be both. But one thing I am quite keen on it is meaningful function names. For example, I never use foo and bar and bars and all that kind of thing, and I never call a variable thing. Like I work with very respected devs who I respect tremendously. But one thing that I will change, like if they send me some code that's technically excellent, I couldn't write because I don't understand the technology enough. But they'll send me a snippet of code which is it's absolute gold for me. It's very valuable stuff. But my only contribution is to replace a variable called thing with something just a tiny bit more. My counter or whatever my index or the index or whatever it was. Instead of thing, and sometimes they. Just little, like I say, just little things like that, and I don't use foo and bar because I think you can always say something a little bit more about what the function's doing, that helps folks just and plus, I mean, I don't know, I just think it's just a tiny bit more professional to give something more of a meaningful name. It's foo and bar is like when you're talking to a colleague or you're sending some code to a coworker. That's fine, and you can call your variable thing or sample or whatever when you're when you're working with colleagues. But I feel like when I'm writing for our customers, our developer customers, you want to. It's like putting a tie on. You just want to be a little bit more formal with them and not quite so kind of jokey and informal. But we are asked in our writing. We are asked to be somewhat informal, For example, so I mean, one example is contractions. You don't say it is, you say it's. You know, it apostrophe s. Things like that just sound a little bit less formal and more. So I guess, I mean, that's interesting because I gave you an example where I felt like I wanted to be more formal in the code than things like foo and bar, and I do think that's correct and appropriate. But when it comes to the actual language, when you're actually talking to them, then we are encouraged to be a little bit more loose. And another thing is you don't say the developer should call this function after, you don't say the developer should, you say you. And actually I don't say should either. I don't say you should call this. What I do is, so I kind of wrapped up 2 points there, but let's separate the 2 points. The first point is don't say the developer, you say you, because that's who's reading your stuff. You already know that the developer's reading the stuff, so you don't have to say that. And the other point that I was going to say was about should. Now, don't I always find that if you're ever inclined to say something that sounds like you're giving an order, you're saying, go and do this, or you should do this, you should do that. If you just stop and think, there's always a way of rewording that in the form of pure information. So if I say you'll get better performance if you call that function before that function, or it's more secure to initialize this structure before passing it to that function, then the reader is going to think, oh, well, if it's more performant, I'll do it. If it's more secure, I'll do it. And so you don't have to say, you should initialize this structure, right? You never, and that's true. Not only is that true in technical writing, I found that that's true in any kind of communication that you can ever give to anybody on whom you can rely to make a rational choice based on the information that they're given. And that really I mean, there's very few cases in life where you actually need to give somebody an instruction without explaining why it's logical. And usually that's, to, let's say, children who haven't developed, the experience or the ability to reason such that they can, if you say that fire will burn the cells in your fingers if you touch it, that's not going to work as effectively as saying don't touch the fire. But I feel like we don't need to do that with developers. And so whenever I see that in the topic, I'll change it to just giving information. And actually that's another thing, is that, like I was saying, some of the job, in fact, actually a lot of the job of a writer is maintaining existing content, and that means that I very often go into a topic that's already, the lines of code are already too wide, so I have to manually break them there. So even if I did have the kind of tooling for my own line widths, it still wouldn't obviate. It wouldn't mean that I didn't have to do that at some point anyway for somebody else's code. And it's the same with language. I often have to go in there and just reword something to be a little bit clearer. There's a dozen ways of expressing any sentence, and sometimes you can just switch switch 2 words. You can take a clause and put it at the start if it's a bit confusing at the end. Sometimes you can have like a little qualifier at the end that just makes it ambiguous. I'm not sure whether that qualifier, like what does that qualifier apply to? So if you often you just move it up to the front of the sentence, and the whole thing's a lot clearer. And even just doing that is kind of rewarding as a writer. You feel like you've polished it just a little bit more. But that's not something that I feel justified in spending a lot of time doing. I mean, I literally could go through when I'm given a new feature area, let's say, because I was given Direct 3D. I'd never written any of the topics. There was obviously tens of thousands, probably, that's an estimate, but maybe there's 10,000 topics in Direct 3D. there's no way I can possibly go through and scrub those and do an edit pass on them and make them read better. There's no way we can afford that. So I wait until I'm already in a topic, I'm already in there fixing something, and then if I feel like I could justify doing a little bit of massaging of a sentence, I just happen to spot something, I just happen to see something that stands out, then I feel okay fixing that. But I certainly won't read through the entire thing and do that, because there just isn't the bandwidth, there just isn't the resource really to do that. And so much of the time you've really got to be driven by the hotspots. You've got to wait for customer GitHub. If there's a customer GitHub issue, that's your evidence that somebody's reading that topic and somebody's having trouble with it. So that, to me, that's valuable. That's good evidence, and that's a good reason to go in and work on that topic. But if I've got no evidence, if there's a topic that's hidden somewhere, I don't know if anybody's reading it, I could go and look at the data. I could go and proactively look at the data, but there's a limit to how much time you really want to spend doing that as well. You really want to wait until there's a reason to make a change, and then look at data. I mean, for example, fixing these broken links, that's another thing. If you feel like there's a lot of broken links throughout the documentation, but you only want to spend a very targeted amount of time, then you say, okay, let me do a little bit of research into the data, and then I'll focus on them in priority order based on page views and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So we covered a lot of stuff there.
Yeah. If you've got a couple of minutes, I was curious on what you think about, because right now a lot of your work is focused on external documentation, trying to teach new users or external users how to use Microsoft products. What do you think about internal documentation and tools like, I don't know, are you aware of Doxygen? Things
Yes.
that would convert your internal documentation to something that could be used by external users. And I think that's something that you see a lot in open source projects.
Yeah, I haven't actually used Doxygen myself, but I've heard of it. Yeah, and of course, sometimes I see GitHub repos that are documented. Do you think they use Doxygen for that?
Yeah, or maybe some other sort of tool which would just go through their code and try to make some comments and try to get that into a nice HTML or markup language.
So so I think that kind of stuff's good. We have put for the documentation that I work on. Of course, we have tools, and we have a build system that was written specifically for the Win32 headers, and then another one for the Windows runtime metadata. But I think if you're not using those mechanisms, then I think these systems are really good. I mean, even something like the C# triple slash. I've forgotten what it's called, but that kind of thing you can generate. I think it's called XML docs, isn't it, or something like that for C#. I think those are really good. There's also apparently my contact in the C++ WinRT team recently showed me that you can do something very kind of like that with Rust. There's a language called Rust, and he's writing Rust WinRT, which is like C++ WinRT, but it's Rust WinRT, using what looks like a very interesting way of documenting that source code, which is along the similar lines to the examples you were talking about as well. And then of course, so I think that's really good. And as long as my feeling is, as long as the documentation isn't literally in the same file as the source code, then I think that's fine. The problem with, if you've got the source code in the same file as if you got the source code and the documentation in the same artifact, literally in the same file, then I just worry. Go on. Is that the whole point?
Yeah,
is that the whole point?
It gets messy. Yeah.
Yeah, it can, and you can have things like every time you make a change, if I as a writer make a perfectly innocent change to a comment, and that ends up having to kick off all kinds of, I don't know. I mean, I imagine that might kick off like a software, a security life cycle review or something like that, or a code review or whatever. Or it could be that, I have a merge conflict because somebody else was changing something really intricate in the code, and I have a merge conflict, and then because I say only because I'm only a writer, not a dev, and then I make a mistake with resolving the conflict, and I end up making a mess of that code. So I don't know. I mean, there's pros and cons, of course, to having it in the same file, and possibly that's the whole point, is to have it in the same file. But um, I think as long as it's only the devs that's working in that file and writing everything that's in it, then that seems perfectly innocent. I mean, safe. Or if you could somehow have a separate file that's got let's say it's got a different file extension. It's the same file name, but it's got a different file extension, and the build system considers those to be the same, two kind of halves of the same piece, the same artifact. Then that feels like it might be better in terms of workflow and avoiding conflicts and being safer. It's just having the programmer, a programmer writer knows code. They know, but they're not at the professional developer level. It just seems dangerous to have them going in and messing around with source code files to that degree. So that would be the only kind of drawbacks that would occur to me with a system like that. And then, of course, I mean, this was something that was talked about at Microsoft. That was that we were trying to get the actual Windows devs to do this kind of thing, to actually put comments in their source code that could then be stripped out and turned into documentation. But the devs just weren't incentivized sufficiently to actually go and do that, so they didn't, and so it never took off. So it comes down to that then as well, doesn't it? It really comes down to that kind of culture, the culture and the motivation around doing it. But I'll tell you what, I'll kind of conclude with this kind of insight really that I feel like I've developed. What I feel like is, instead of having a system such as open authoring where anybody can go in and contribute to the docs, and then you have a writer go through and kind of work on that and to polish it and to kind of scrub it and edit it. What I find much better is if the subject matter expert, if the PM or the dev or whatever sends me a spec or a blog post or something that's got their raw knowledge, and I say raw because it's highly valuable because it's got all the knowledge inside it, but it's raw in the sense that it's not really it's not necessarily ready for customers to look at. Sometimes you do get content that is really close to ready, for customers, but also a lot of the time it's not. It wasn't really written for that purpose. It was written for an internal audience. And so if I can get that, and I can internalize that stuff, that what I call raw materials, if I can internalize it and use that to understand the space, then to me that is very, very valuable, because it means that I can then take my internal understanding of it, and I can then factor that and package it in a way whose very original design and purpose was to be educational. Whereas I don't think that's necessarily the pivot that you get with material that's coming in from open authoring from an external contributor, whether that's external outside the writing organization, whether that's a Microsoft person or a non-Microsoft person. They've not necessarily factored it in that way. They've not necessarily pivoted in that way, even though the facts in there may well be accurate. So I would rather get it sent straight to me. Don't send it to open authoring. Send it straight to me. Any way you like. I ask them to send it to me, and I'll work on it, and then I can put my pull request through. and I can, you know, it can just go straight through, and so you have a lot less kind of paperwork and workflow going on. So I find that much more efficient. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that was a really nice and informational session.
Yeah.
Uh, I
Mm.
love to just hear your thoughts about coding and commenting and things like that. That was pretty cool. Yeah, so I've just been trying to sort of like talk to like use this internship opportunity that I have to
Yeah.
just meet new people, and meet people in these different fields, new and different fields, and just like sort of understand what their process is like, what their work is like. And I'm hoping that I could use this information and just share it with other people,
Yeah.
through some sort of interview format or something. And you were actually like the first person I'm trying this on, so it's
Cool.
still pretty rough, and I don't know what the best way to do this or the best way to move forward with this is, but yeah, so I'll just try to work on this video or this interview, and then see how it goes, see what kind of feedback I get.
Yeah, it's a good idea. I think you got a good idea there with that approach in interviewing various people in different fields. So just one thing is, so I was uh, every now and again I would stop and see whether you had questions or a particular direction you wanted to go in.
Mhm.
Um, but I also was aware that I was talking and talking, and I was wondering whether, oh, am I talking too much? Does he want me to change subject? Does he have a question for me, kind of thing? So
Yeah,
um, I probably talked too much, and I probably didn't stop and say, have you got any questions? Enough. So one thing that you might want to do is before you get the other person talking, before you get them on a roll, say something like, is it okay, is it okay if I like put my hand up or something and stop you when I've got a question? Because some people might be even worse than me. They might just talk non-stop for an hour, and you might not even, and it's hard, isn't it? It's difficult to
yeah,
kind of jump in and stop somebody when they're clearly enjoying themselves talking about stuff. So if you've already agreed up front the protocol of, you don't have to interrupt verbally. You got the protocol of sticking your hand up or something like that. Then you'll be able to get them back on track. If they've kind of gone off
yeah,
track or whatever, that might not be a bad idea to agree that up front. And they'll be, obviously they'll be happy to do that, because they want to give you the material that you want to get.
yeah. Would sort of like having an agenda and sharing that with you in advance help? Like a
Yeah,
full script of like things that we would want to talk about. Yeah.
yeah, definitely. That absolutely, that would be good.
Okay.
And again, it's you want a mix of structure. You want some kind of structure if possible. Um, I already knew the kind of things that we could talk about, so it's not super important,
Yeah.
but if you can have some kind of optional basic framework, but also make it to some degree flexible as well, then I would say that's probably the perfect mix. Yeah,
Okay.
sounds good. All right,
Yeah.
Amog. Well, thank you, and have a good internship,
Yeah.
and keep up the good work, I say. I'll see you later.
Oh,
Bye.
thank you.